Good? All right, staff, students, administrators, members of the public, and everyone watching on the live stream, regardless of your opinion, welcome to the debate of the semester, abortion, whose body, whose choice? So first I'd like to thank the organizers, the National Campus Life Network, the Laurier Society for Open Inquiry, LifeLink, the Laurier Student Union, specifically Jason Verhoeve, the Director of Student Experience, and the Laurier Special Constables, specifically Constable Hunt. I'd also like to thank the sponsors, Mike Hale, Bonnie Pember, and Nung de Vries from London Area Right to Life Association, Jane Richards and her whole team at KW Right to Life, as well as Diane Poussin for their generous sponsorship. Without their support, this event would not be possible. So a couple housekeeping things. Washrooms are located out the back doors down the hall. If you need to excuse yourself, you will be readmitted by security and at a suitable break in the debate. Filming and photography and social media is encouraged, but please do so silently and without flash out of respect for the debaters. Please also take a moment to silence your phones for the benefit of the speakers and your neighbors. The entire event is being live streamed on National Campus Life Network's Facebook page and is being recorded for later upload online. The event can be found on Twitter with the hashtag Laurier Abortion Debate. Fire protocol. In the event of a fire alarm, please evacuate the room in a calm and orderly manner by heading for the closest exit sign. Security and the fire department will do their best to thoroughly, safely, and quickly establish if we can re-enter the space, which is the goal. If it is determined that we cannot re-enter Bricker Academic, we will reconvene at Waterloo Memorial Recreation Complex in the Hauser House, located at 101 Father David Bauer Drive, Waterloo. That's on your pamphlet as well. Please watch National Campus Life Network's Twitter feed at NCLN for an announcement regarding re-entry into Bricker Academic or relocation onto Hauser House and the Rec Complex. There will also be a reception at Wilf's, so the on-campus pub, after the debate, and everyone is welcome to continue the conversation and discussion there. So now I will say a few words. I am deeply concerned with the collective moral panic that is permeating our university campuses today. There's an attitude that everything that doesn't go along with the dominant narrative of diversity and inclusion and equity is hate speech and therefore must be shut down. There's actually a Carleton University professor who argued that we should restrict visiting speakers to ones sponsored by faculty. So in this case, student groups like LifeLink today, who organize this debate, wouldn't even be able to independently organize events or book guest speakers. And with many professors becoming more and more ideologically homogenous and convinced that universities should be safe spaces, this is a major problem. I don't think it's a crazy prediction to say that in 10 years, debates like this one tonight would be stopped from taking place. There were many people who said that our event tonight should not even happen because the debate on abortion is over. So I'm going to read a quote, and it's actually from a radical feminist author, Andrea Dworkin. It's from her 1983 book, Right Wing Women. There's some choice language. It's not my fault, I didn't write it. The sexual revolution, in order to work, required that abortion be available to women on demand. If it were not, fucking would not be available to men on demand. Getting laid was at stake. Not just getting laid, but getting laid the way a great number of boys and men had always wanted. Lots of girls who wanted it all the time, outside marriage, free, giving it away. The male-dominated left agitated for, and fought for, and argued for, and even organized for, and even provided political and economic resources for abortion rights for women. The left was militant on the issue. So I was personally fascinated by this paragraph when I came across it, because it adds a very interesting angle to the socio-cultural history of abortion rights. The question we always focus on when it comes to abortion is whose bodies, whose choice, and this is the question featured in our debate tonight. This question of whose body, whose choice is not a simple one, and as the Andrea Dworkin quote implies, there are sometimes counterintuitive ways to approach the issue. So I can't wait to hear the views of our debaters tonight, so let me introduce everyone who is involved. First, our moderator, Mrs. Barbara Kay. Barbara Kay graduated from the University of Toronto in Honours English Language and Literature in 1964. She attended McGill University's graduate school and received her MA in English Literature in 1966. For many years, Barbara taught literature and composition at Concordia University and various Montreal CEGEPs. For 25 years, she edited an annually published creative writing anthology for high school students called First Fruits. Barbara's journalism career began in the 1990s with frequent contributions to Cité Libre, the Federalist magazine founded by Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and reanimated in the run-up group to the 1995 referendum as a tool to combat separatism. Since 2003, Barbara has been a weekly columnist for the National Post, writing frequently on such diverse subjects as cultural misandry, freedom of speech, Islamist reverberations in Western culture, and the bizarre world of canine politics. She also writes a weekly column for the online publication of news and commentary at thepostmillennial.com. Barbara's writing has also appeared in publications such as the C2C Journal Online, the New York Daily News, Campus Watch, Front Page Magazine, Pajamas Media, the Dorchester Review, and the Prince Arthur Herald. Barbara is a regular contributor to a number of radio talk shows, both local and national. In 2010, Barbara was a speaker at Moses Neimer's annual Idea City in Toronto, speaking on the theme of honor-motivated violence. In June 2017, she returned to Idea City with a talk about the normalization of female cover in Western culture, entitled How to Launder a Hijab. In 2012, Barbara published with Aruna Pap, Aruna's memoir, Unworthy Creature, a Punjabi daughter's memoir of honor, shame, and love. In 2013, Barbara published her own collection of original and never before published reviews and talks, Acknowledgements, a cultural memoir and other essays. In 2015, Barbara published a 3-day event, a murder mystery novel. Barbara sits on the advisory and/or executive boards of the Canadian Association for Equality, the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, and the Montreal Press Club. She has won numerous awards, the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, the National Coalition of Men's Award for Gender Fairness in Journalism, and the Diamond Jubilee Medal for Excellence in Journalism. And now on to our debaters. So representing the pro-choice side is Dr. Fraser Fellows. He was born in Windsor, Ontario. He is married with children, stepchildren, and grandchildren, educated at Queen's, Western, and Oxford universities. He is an OBGYN prof at Western, and his work as an obstetrician and gynecologist includes the provision of abortion services. He's a member of the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada, the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons, and the National Abortion Federation. And representing the pro-life side is Oriana Hirosishin. Oriana is the Eastern Community Outreach Coordinator for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. Since 2015, she has engaged and spoken to hundreds of Canadians about abortion and has witnessed countless hearts and minds change towards the pro-life view. She continues to speak to and equip young people in pro-life apologetics across Ontario. Oriana graduated from Western University in 2017 with a Bachelor's of Science in Genetics and Medical Science. She is currently studying paramedicine in Toronto. During her time at Western, she co-founded London Against Abortion and was president of Western's pro-life club, Western Lifeline. All right, and Mrs. Kay is going to give some introductory remarks.
Yes. Whoops. Thank you, Lindsay. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to finally meet you. I've been an admirer of your work for many months. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and I'm very pleased to be here. Abortion is a subject that refuses to go away, even when the government declares it a settled and closed matter. Our Prime Minister has decreed pro-choice absolutism as a litmus test for party inclusion, and has demanded attestation to abortion approval as a prerequisite for any charitable organization's eligibility for summer job grants. These aggressive gestures have backfired. As National Post columnist Andrew Coyne recently noted, amazingly, the primary effect of the government's ham-handed attempt to banish abortion opponents to the margin of Canadian society has been to give them the most sympathetic hearing they have had in years, even from a media that leans overwhelmingly in favor of abortion rights. As Coyne further noted, even if we had an abortion law, it is not against the law to oppose a law, a truism our present government and progressive ideologues seem to have difficulty understanding. So I am very glad this debate is taking place, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to participate in it. The title, Whose Body, Whose Choice, I have to say I see a bit of irony in these words. A few years ago I read an article about abortion written by an ardent feminist who argued that only women are forced to challenge the state for reproductive freedoms. She asked the taunting question, and I'm giving the gist here because I couldn't find the actual quotation. When do men ever have to worry about the state controlling their bodies without their consent? That gave me a bit of a laugh and fodder for a column in which I pointed out that for all of organized human history, except for the last few decades, men's bodies have, without their consent, and often against their will, been sent to war to fight and die to protect the women and children of their tribes and nations. Indeed, both men and women became free to control their own bodily destinies at about the same time, when women got the pill and men got voluntary conscription. But men are still conscripted in many countries, and even in countries where men and women are both conscripted, only men are forced into combat roles. They would be conscripted again in this country if we were invaded by enemies. Something to keep in mind when we talk about bodies and absolute gender rights. As soon as notice of the debate appeared, I received a few Twitter notifications critiquing me as a bad choice for moderator because I am not neutral in the abortion debate. I tweeted back that nobody in public life is neutral on this question because everybody holds opinions on abortion. But what my critics really assumed was, because I often defend pro-lifers' right to promote their beliefs, I must automatically share their beliefs. The reality is that I am neither pro-life nor pro-choice, at least not as defined by the activists who stake out their respective turfs on this contested terrain. If I appear in my public comments to be more sympathetic to the pro-life camp, it has more to do with revulsion against the bullying tactics of their political enemies than with my personal beliefs. The pro-lifers are only asking for the right to voice their beliefs alongside those who do not share them, while the pro-choice camp actively works to ensure that their own often intimidated voices are the only ones permitted a platform, both on campus and, as noted, systematically throughout our social and cultural institutions. On the freedom of speech front, pro-life is the underdog and deserving of my encouragement. That said, I'm happy to have the opportunity to clarify my views on the actual subject of abortion. I think I represent the views of most Canadians, which makes me technically a middle-of-the-roader. For when polls on abortion are taken, there are relatively few Canadians who take a stand at either extreme. A small percentage of Canadians truly believes that the unborn have natural rights that must always be privileged over the mother's wishes or the circumstances of the conception. They believe abortion is never morally justifiable. At the other extreme, a small percentage of Canadians believes that the unborn have no rights at any stage of pregnancy, and that access to abortion for any reason whatsoever should remain unfettered and even unjudged. Although they differ on whose rights should be considered paramount, both sides have in common the elements of consistency and complete confidence in their opinion. But the vast majority of Canadians don't consider consistency an absolute virtue, and they consider the issue too complex for absolutism of any kind. They believe, as I do, that while abortion should be accessible and publicly funded, it should also be regulated, as it is everywhere else in the world, save for a few totalitarian societies. But that would require an abortion law. I would like Canada to have an abortion law, and so would a lot of other Canadians. What we know from credible surveys is that most Canadians, including me, are sickened that a perfectly viable unborn child in the late stages of pregnancy can be aborted. That it happens rarely is no comfort. Most Canadians are also disgusted by abortions that are performed to thwart the birth of a child on the grounds of her sex, which is not at all uncommon within certain cultural enclaves. Most Canadians are furthermore troubled by abortions undertaken casually or serially. We wonder why, in an era of safe and reliable pregnancy prevention, taxpayers should be funding third, fourth, and fifth abortions. In short, we have watched with dismay as what used to be a matter of conscience, undertaken with emotional anguish and a heavy heart, is dumbed down to a service of convenience for many women and even a form of retroactive birth control to which no moral consideration is given. But one cannot voice these concerns in the public forum without being mobbed and vilified as misogynist. The intolerance and illiberalism of pro-choice spokespeople is my biggest beef with that movement. But I also have a significant beef with the pro-life movement's absolutism. I recognize that abortion is the snuffing out of a human life in its formative stage. But I also recognize that nature itself snuffs out incipient human life with casual frequency. No woman who has experienced both a miscarriage and the loss of a living child would ever confuse the sadness of the former with the existential anguish of the other. This is the human reality, and while I understand that I'm not intellectually consistent in assigning greater moral rights to second and third trimester unborn babies than to those in the first trimester, I feel a certain synchronicity with my human nature in making that distinction, which leads to my grave discomfort with parts of the pro-life communication strategy in particular. I am deeply offended by the advocacy project known as GAP, which I understand is in abeyance, but for 20 years has been the principal means of communication of the point of view of the pro-life movement. It was initiated in 1998. The GAP means the Genocide Awareness Project. I find it intellectually flawed and exploitative of real genocides, especially the world's greatest human tragedy, the Holocaust, a word that crops up frequently in pro-life discourse. Why is the GAP campaign intellectually flawed? Because it extrapolates one superficial detail from genocides, the numbers killed, to proclaim a moral equivalence between two phenomena that have nothing other than numbers in common. The most salient point of a genocide is not the number of lives extinguished. It is the unchecked hatred of innocent people whose only crime is their racial or ethnic heritage. Fetuses do not belong to an identity group. Every single abortion in this country is an individual choice made by an individual woman. There is no public central killing ground where the violence against the victims is used as a bonding agent for the persecutors. A woman who aborts a fetus is not cheering on the killing of other fetuses, nor does she hate her own. She is simply choosing her particular interests over that of the unborn child. By using the genocide trope, GAP compares women who have abortions to Nazis. There is neither truth nor righteousness in accusing women of such moral turpitude. In my opinion, GAP is, or was, if it's truly gone, a self-defeating project. It is offensive to cultural groups whose present is haunted by the specter of past genocides and the fear of future ones. And I believe it alienates more open-minded people from the pro-life cause than are persuaded to it. Nevertheless, I would never advocate that GAP or any campaign be banned from campus on those grounds. I would only say that I hope that people who share my view keep trying to convince pro-lifers to choose a more effective communication strategy. Finally, the polarization and politicization of views on abortion has obscured an element that should be part of the discussion, but almost never is, and that is the epidemiology of abortion. Pro-choicers have remained willfully stuck, at least for discussion purposes, in what seems the distant past, before DNA and ultrasound and female selective abortion entered the picture and altered the consciousness of objective observers. But they are also oblivious to, or resistant to, open discussion of the known and suspected effects of abortion on women's future health and reproductive competence. Anyone who has read my columns on abortion knows that the epidemiology of abortion is a special interest of mine. And as I have noted in columns, in the last decade, 4 important peer-reviewed studies have confirmed, quote, immutable medical risk factors for preterm birth in pregnancies linked to a prior induced abortion. That means if you've had an abortion, especially if you've had more than one, in your next pregnancy, if it's a wanted pregnancy, there is quite a significant elevated risk of having a preterm birth with all that implies. And the more previous abortions, the exponential higher risk of preterm birth with the physical and cognitive risks to the baby that involves. Yet I would be surprised if more than 1 in 100 women considering an abortion were aware of this fact. Abortion providers almost never tell their clients about that link. I once had a young woman friend visit a variety of abortion clinics pretending to be pregnant and seeking counsel. First, she had a hard time getting counsel at all. When she did, and even when she specifically asked if an abortion impacted a future pregnancy, she could not get a single abortion provider to admit to any risks at all, even for multiple abortions for future pregnancies. Pro-choicers talk a lot about a woman's right to choose. Pro-lifers talk a lot about the rights of the unborn child. And I talk a lot about a woman's right to informed consent. The most important right of all at the moment, though, is the right to express one's opinion in a civil fashion with respectful attention paid, and so on with the debate. So, arguing for the pro-choice camp, our first speaker will be Dr. Fraser Fellows, and after Oriana Hurricane, sorry. And each debater will have 20 minutes to make their case. Clarissa here in the front will let each debater know when there's 5 minutes left, 3 minutes left, and 1 minute left. And after that, we'll have a rebuttal of 7 minutes each to ask questions of the other, and then we'll be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A, and finally each presenter will have 10 minutes apiece to summarize their position in closing statements. So I would ask Dr. Fellows now to come up.
So I was pleased to receive this request for a debate about abortion. I've done this a few times. In this particular instance, I'm debating with Ms. Laurier. I think it's your first time. I don't pretend to be an expert at debating. However, I do feel quite passionately about the topic, and hopefully this will make up for some inadequacies. As Mrs. K mentioned, I'm aware of our current Canadian leadership, Mr. Trudeau, trying to restrict debate about abortion, and I think that's obviously a serious shortcoming of he and his government. I'm also aware that Laurier in recent times has not got a great record as far as the free expression of one's opinion. Hopefully that tonight's meeting is an indication that might be changing. First of all, I'll give you a perspective of the issue of abortion. A day in the life of the world. Approximately 100 million acts of intercourse will take place, 910,000 conceptions will occur, 150,000 abortions will be performed, and 500 women will die from criminal or illegal abortions. 384,000 babies will be born, 1,370 mothers will die during or after pregnancy, 25,000 infants will die during the first year of life, and 14,000 children aged 1 to 4 will die. 250,000 is the amount the world's population will grow. So debating this issue will always remain current and relevant. Whose body is it? This question is or should be redundant in any society. Canadians and any unoppressed society have decriminalized abortion. Canada did so 28 years ago. In ours and most societies, women have a choice with respect to the continuation or not of a pregnancy. No other individual, interest group, or government has control over any of her body functions, including reproduction, just her. All free countries, including Canada, support the concept that a fetus does not become a person until birth. Very important note. A pregnant uterus, a fetus, has no legal status in society. Society has witnessed women's vehement reaction to being bullied, harassed, assaulted, or demeaned from time immemorial. Women, and of course men, are opposed to anyone usurping control of their bodies in any way, shape, or form. As with men, they deserve complete autonomy with respect to all body functions. We, society, governments, and men have no right to tell a woman how to use any part of their bodies, brains, hearts, or uteri. Whose choice? I'm an ardent advocate of freedom of expression and protest. Not to protest a woman's right to choice, rather society's failure to assist in preventing most abortions in the first place. What I mean by this is that we have the infrastructure, the financial and educational wherewithal to significantly reduce our abortion rate. A decade ago, Russian women underwent an average of 8 abortions in their lifetime. In Canada, there are approximately 100,000 abortions per year, 14 per thousand in the age group 15 to 44. We need to protest that women should be able to access effective contraception to protect themselves from unplanned or unwanted pregnancies. There's a plethora of literature supporting the concept that improving access to contraception reduces the need for abortion. Protesting abortion increases our awareness that we have failed much of the population that is seeking an abortion. Protesting a lack of either 1, 2, 3, or 4 would have a significant impact on reducing abortion rates. I do not endorse targeting patients seeking abortions, clinics providing abortions, or abortion providers. No other government, interest group, woman or man has a right to an individual's choice. I strongly endorse a woman's right to choose. And that's it. That's all I have to say about it.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Audio?
Can everyone hear me well? Everyone in the back is good? A bit closer. I'm being told to go a bit closer. Is that good? Hey, good evening, everyone. Let me start by saying thank you to Dr. Fellows for agreeing to partake in this debate with me this evening, and thank you, Barbara and Lindsay, for emceeing and moderating tonight's event. While the exchange of open ideas is often stifled on university campuses, I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us and for understanding the need to continue much needed open dialogue on the topic of abortion. Now, the debate question that I've been asked to address tonight in regards to abortion is whose body, whose choice? And in order to answer that question, we first need to determine how many bodies or entities are involved in a pregnancy. Of course, there's the body of the pregnant woman, whose rights and value we obviously recognize. However, is she the only body that's involved in a pregnancy? If we consider this volume rendered CT scan using radio contrast of a woman at 37 weeks gestation, we see the ribs, spine, vasculature, and internal organs of that woman. However, we also see a second spine, ribs, skull, and long bones. This second skeletal system does not belong to the pregnant woman, but rather to that of the other body that's involved in a pregnancy, the body of the preborn child or fetus. And so when considering abortion and its implications, we must recognize and take into account both the bodies of the mother and that of the preborn child. Since we know if there was no second body, then abortion would not be needed in the first place. A bit louder. One of my colleagues at the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform has a young niece, and her name is Sophie Grace. Now, Sophie Grace is 7 months old, but after she was born, she spent 141 days in a hospital, and that's because she was born premature. In fact, she was born so premature at 23 weeks and 1 day that she's what we call a micropreemie. This is what Sophie looked like the very day that she was born. And you can see that babies at this stage, they weigh about 1 pound, and they're about 7 inches in length. Like Sophie, their skin is thin and delicate, and that's because they haven't had the time to develop the brown fat that keeps us and more older children warm. They have fully formed eyelashes, eyebrows, fingernails, and even fully formed hearing. Now, although all of Sophie's major organ structures were in place at 8 weeks after she came into existence, at the time of her birth at 21 weeks and 1 day, they were still severely underdeveloped. And that's why a lot of preemies like Sophie require extra support and care in hospital after their birth. Sophie, upon her birth, was given that chance and that nurturing that she needed to develop into the healthy baby that she is today. However, in this country, not all preborn children Sophie's age are given that same choice. This is because in Canada, abortion is permitted through all 9 months of pregnancy up until the very moment of birth, funded by our tax dollars. Dr. Fellows is an OBGYN who performs abortions up until 23 weeks and 6 days. Sophie was born at 23 weeks and 1 day. What this means is that every single day in this country, nearly 300 preborn children, older, younger, or the exact same gestational age as Sophie was at birth, have their lives violently torn from them. Now, of course, if preborn children are nothing more than a blob of tissue or a clump of cells, then the abortion procedure is no big deal. However, if that second entity is more than that, then the implications of abortion are grave. I'd like to ask you to consider the following. Do you believe in human rights? Now, I would hope that the majority, if not everyone in this room, believes in human rights, and so I'd like to ask you, who do you think gets human rights? Who deserves human rights? I often ask these questions to university students that I speak with on campuses doing pro-life activism, and most, if not all, like Jake at U of T, for example, respond saying that they believe all human beings deserve human rights. So let's examine that for a second. If we, like Jake, believe that human beings are equal and equally deserving of human rights, does this extend to the preborn? We know that if two human beings reproduce, the species of their offspring must be human too. In other words, the second entity in a human pregnancy will always be a human embryo or a human fetus. To deny a preborn child their rights by saying that they're not human but just a fetus or just an embryo is scientifically inaccurate, because the term fetus and embryo are not species classifications but rather age classifications. Fetus, which is Latin for young one, tells us how old someone is, not what someone is. And so to determine what species someone belongs to, we have to ask, what species are their parents? Secondly, we also know that if someone is rapidly growing and developing, then they must be alive, because something that's growing and developing cannot be dead. And so, since preborn children have human parents, and because they're growing in utero up until the point of their birth, we know that they are both human and living. And given the fact that they're human and living just like you and me, wouldn't it logically follow that they deserve the same human rights as you and I do? Now, Article 3 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights states that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, with everyone referring to all members of the human species, as stated in the preamble of the document. Human rights doctrines show us that it's evident that human beings deserve human rights, and it's only logical that human rights should begin when human beings begin. So the question then to ask is, when does that human life begin? The 7th edition of Keith Moore's embryology textbook, The Developing Human, Clinically Oriented Embryology, states the following: human life begins at fertilization, the process during which a male gamete or sperm unites with a female gamete or oocyte to form a single cell called a zygote. This highly specialized, totipotent cell marked the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. What does this mean? Essentially, there's only 3 points at which human life begins. Either human life begins sometime before fertilization, at fertilization, or sometime after fertilization. So let's consider the first. We know that an egg left alone in a female's body, or a sperm left alone in a male's body without being fertilized, can never on its own develop into a fully formed human being like you and I. This is because sperm and eggs are human parts and not human wholes. And so we know human life doesn't begin sometime before fertilization. Now let's flip it over to the other side. If you were walking down the street and you saw a 3-year-old on the side of the road, would you assume that they just popped into thin air and that they came into existence, developed to the point that a 3-year-old would? Of course not. We all logically know that that 3-year-old must have developed from an earlier, less developed version of themselves. And we can trace their development from when they were an infant, a neonate, a fetus, an embryo, a morula, a blastocyst, and initially a zygote, the single-celled embryo that's formed at the point of fertilization. And so we know that human life doesn't begin before fertilization, and we know it doesn't take place after fertilization, so it would logically follow that human life begins at fertilization, the moment of sperm-egg fusion. At this point, a whole, living, new human being comes into existence with DNA unique from every other human being in this world. And at this point, at that single-celled human age, that human being has everything from eye color to hair color coded for. I've now explained that preborn children are human and living and deserving of human rights just like you and I from the moment that they come into existence at fertilization. The question now remains, is abortion a human rights violation? And in order to answer that question, we need to consider what abortion is. Now, those who are in support of abortion often call themselves pro-choice. My question would be, pro what choice? What is being chosen when a woman decides to have an abortion, and whose body is targeted during the abortion procedure? Now, by definition, induced abortion is the direct and intentional killing of a preborn child through premature termination of pregnancy, using either chemical or surgical means, depending on the child's gestational age. Now, there are different types of abortions that are performed in Canada. A chemical abortion uses 2 different types of medications, usually beginning with a drug called RU486, which are taken orally. And when combined, these 2 drugs cause severe cramping and bleeding, which will expel the dead preborn child. Now, it's interesting to note that the National Abortion Federation, in its guidelines to physicians for prescribing medical abortion, suggests that physicians inform their patients that although small, there's a chance that they may see the body of the preborn child that is expelled among the blood clots that are usually and commonly expelled during a medical abortion. This reinforces the fact that abortion targets the body of the preborn child. A different type of abortion that is performed in Canada is that of a suction dilation curettage. Now, this is usually performed under anesthetic and begins when the cervix is artificially dilated using a series of rigid rods, after which a hollow tube can be inserted into the uterus and hooked up to a suction machine, 10 to 20 times the force of a regular household vacuum. Now, once the suction is turned on, the fetal parts of the baby are torn off and collected into the collection bottle. A loop-shaped knife called a curette can then be used to scrape away any remaining fetal parts or placenta. This is the most common type of abortion used in Canada, as the majority of abortions take place from 9 to 12 weeks gestation. A dilation and evacuation abortion is performed after 13 weeks and uses or employs a pair of forceps that are used to dismember and extract the fetus with the help of suction piece by piece. Now, the baby at this point is much larger, and at around 20 weeks, the size of their head is about that of a plum. And so crushing and rotating techniques need to be applied in order to effectively move the fetal parts of that preborn child. The Society of Obstetrics and Gynecologists of Canada, the guideline for performing induced abortions, suggests that the fetal tissue should not be removed forcibly through the cervix, as bone spicules may lacerate the cervix. Whose bone spicules? That of the preborn child. Lastly, there's an induction abortion, which takes multiple days to perform, and in which the body of the preborn child is expelled whole as opposed to in parts. Now, this is done by the injection of an inducing agent, such as prostaglandins, urea, or sometimes the drug digoxin, which is injected directly into the amniotic cavity or into the preborn child, his or herself. Now, this causes the death of the fetus, after which the dead preborn child can be delivered. This is what happens in Canada to the youngest and most vulnerable of our kind. However, in order to have an intellectually honest discussion about the act of abortion, we need to be able to consider the very act of abortion, what it does, and who it affects. And so on that note, I'm going to briefly show you the photographic visual evidence of the abortion procedure. The Canadian Medical Association Code of Ethics states in Article 9 that physicians must, quote, refuse to participate in or support practices that violate basic human rights, end quote. Though isn't what we just saw a clear violation of a human being's human rights? Not only has society denied preborn children their status in the human family and stripped them of their human rights, but of their basic right to life, this is due in part because people have chosen to ignore the scientific evidence about when human life begins in lieu of the subjective language of personhood. I often hear students justify abortion by saying that it may be a human, but it's not a person. Now, going back to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, it's important to note that the term human is used here because the term human is an objective term that can be proven scientifically. unlike the legal term person, which has had a changing definition throughout history. And so the language of personhood, in essence, is the language of discrimination, because the moment societies deny personhood based on a quality that some humans possess, but not all, inevitably someone gets left out. In many of the most disturbing human rights violations in history, the idea of human plus X has been propagated. For example, during the time of the American slave trade, the term person was used to discriminate against people of color, because to be a person was to be human plus white. In 1922, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that women under the law were not persons, because during that time to be a person was to be human plus male. In 2018, in Canada, preborn children are not considered to be persons under the law, because under the law, to be a person deserving of human rights, you need to be human plus born. Yet Article 17 of the Canadian Medical Association Code of Ethics instructs that physicians, quote, in providing medical service, do not discriminate against any patient on grounds such as age. Now, our development as humans is reflective of age. As an embryo, we are much less developed than we are now. We're much smaller. We have more abilities now. We have more functionality. We're in a different location than we were back then. All these things change as we grow and develop. Why? Because they are reflective of our age. And to suggest that only humans of a certain age or ability are worthy of protection is to suggest that those of us that are older can discriminate against those of us that are younger. If after birth our age and our level of development does not matter when talking about human rights, why then would it matter prior to birth? Now, we know that preborn children are human and we know what abortion does to them, but what we haven't considered is the women who choose to have an abortion. Let me be very clear in saying that while I condemn the act of abortion, I do not condemn those I do not condemn the actors, those who have chosen to have an abortion. And the reason for that is simple. I think we can all agree that no woman walks into a clinic eager to have an abortion. In fact, in my 3 years of doing pro-life street activism, when speaking with women who have experienced abortion, the number one response that I hear from every single woman is that they felt like they had no other choice in their situation. How is it that advocates of abortion who praise themselves as being, how is it that advocates of abortion praise themselves as being pro-choice when the woman that they claim to be supporting often feel as they have no choice? Now, there are many countless difficult circumstances surrounding pregnancy and why women choose to have an abortion. However, rarely in these difficult circumstances does abortion address the root problem. I've spoken with countless women who, for example, have chosen to have an abortion because of abuse that they've experienced from their partners, because of poverty, or because of sexual assault, just as examples. However, in these situations, abortion is always a temporary solution to a permanent problem. Abortion does not turn an abusive partner into a loving one. It does not make a poor woman rich, and it does not magically erase the pain and trauma that's associated with experiencing a sexual assault. As a young woman who fits the age demographic of 20 to 24-year-olds with the highest abortion rate in Canada, I think it's sad that when we find ourselves in difficult situations, the solution we are often first presented with is that of a quick fix of abortion. Because abortion is not only life-ending for a preborn child, but it's also often life-altering for the pregnant woman. Now, a 2017 recent peer-reviewed study posted in the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons surveyed 987 women who had had abortions, and what they found was that after an abortion, there was a 54.5% increase in women regularly seeing. Sorry.
We're out of time.
You want to finish your sentence.
There's a 54.5% increase in women regularly seeing counselors, psychologists, or psychiatrists, and a 44.4% increase in prescription drug abuse for psychological purposes. This tells us that abortion is not only life-altering for pregnant women, but also life-ending for preborn children.
Good. ask Dr. Fellows, you have 10 minutes to do a rebuttal or to pose questions to Oriana. Sorry, 7 minutes. 7 minutes. 7 minutes. Okay. So, do you want to stay there or?
You want to bring that microphone over here?
I don't know if it'll reach, then absolutely.
Well, Ms. Rishin certainly gives very compelling information and some very vivid pictures of what is inevitably and always a tragedy for a woman to have to expose herself to. I think that the bottom line is, as I said in my introductory comments, our society, we Canadians, have declared, along with most other unoppressed countries, that the fetus has no status. And in fact, although Ms. Rishin mentioned that the abortions in Canada can occur up until 37 weeks, in fact, abortions do not occur in Canada beyond 23 weeks and 6 days. And these guidelines have been set by, and these are international guidelines, France, England, Australia, Canada, all have these guidelines that abortions will not occur over that gestational age. And that gestational age relates to when a fetus can predictably be born without significant risk of morbidity and mortality after it's born. Having said that, we know that the chances of a fetus born at 23 weeks and 24 weeks of staying alive are remote at best, and the chances of the fetus being intact without some major disability is also very remote. And this is why this line of 23 weeks and 6 days is set, because there is little chance before that. Obviously there are exceptions, and the 23-week and 1-day exception is what you demonstrated or what you showed evidence of, and there will be exceptions to every general statement, but the bottom line is that most of these fetuses do not do well afterward. So I think that, again, my posture is that we have no obligation as a society, as set by our own society, to prevent abortions from occurring before 24 weeks. And society has decreed this. And I certainly agree that we can do better than abortion. And as I said in my opening statement, if we're going to protest, we should protest on the grounds that we as a society are not doing enough to prevent women from finding themselves in this position, providing contraception, providing information that allows them to be equals amongst men in our society, providing them with the ability to protect themselves from violence and rape, etc. So I think that abortion is a necessary event in our society, and I do abortions up until 23 weeks and 6 days, and I am simply following guidelines that are set by the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada, and in fact an international standard by doing abortions up until this gestational age.
Thank you. Oriana?
Thank you, Dr. Hollis. I want to start by asking you how long have you been providing abortions for?
Since abortion became legal.
Do you know roughly how many abortions you've performed since then?
I don't.
you stated that you performed abortion up until 23 weeks and 6 days. Of the abortion procedures that I described, could you please tell us which abortion procedures you performed?
I perform abortions up from early stages till the late stages, yes.
And can you specify what procedures you perform?
Well, we have basically 3 approaches to abortion. There's the medical abortion using epicrystone and epitaxate or misoprostol, and there's the suction up until 14 weeks, and then there is the what they call the dilatation and evacuation up until 23 weeks and 6 days, which is a surgical abortion, typically done in an operating room under general anesthesia.
And so those procedures that I described, is that an accurate reflection of the abortions that you perform?
Yes.
The video footage, the visual evidence of what abortion does to preborn children, does that accurately depict your practice?
The video evidence of what?
The video evidence of what abortion does to preborn children, is that accurately depict the abortions that you perform?
Yes.
Yes. Dr. Fellows, I showed you the picture of Sophie Grace, who was born at 23 weeks and 1 day. Now, if her mother had chosen that she did not want to continue her pregnancy, would she be able to walk into your clinic and request an abortion on the day of Sophie's birth?
Yes.
And what type of abortion procedure would you have used to end the life of Sophie as depicted above?
So the abortion is carried out by, first of all, the patient comes into the clinic on her own volition. She makes an appointment, and then she, excuse me, sorry. So the patient has phoned the clinic, they get an appointment, they are seen by a nurse and a social worker, and then they are, the procedures described to them, risks and complications are described to them, and they also give them pamphlets giving this same information. If they decide to go through with the procedure, then they come back to the clinic the following day or a couple of days later, and they have the cervix is prepared by using what we call osmotic dilators, and then they have, this is for patients over 18 weeks. Then they have, they come back to the clinic a few hours later, have further dilators put into the cervix, and at that time the fetus is injected with digoxin. So the fetus at that point is no longer alive, and then the following day the patient comes to the clinic, or to the operating room, and the fetus is removed.
Sophie's mother, of course, decided to continue with the pregnancy and gave birth to Sophie. However, as you just described, if she had chosen that that's not what she wanted, then you would end the life of her child. My question for you is someone's humanity is a preborn child's humanity based on someone else's opinion of them? In other words, if I am pregnant and I choose that I want to keep my baby, then that child has moral worth. However, if I choose not to continue that pregnancy, then at that point, it would be, or you would perform an abortion. So is our humanity dictated by what other people, but by other people's opinions of us?
I think the important thing is what you were talking about when you were, as you were asking this question, you were talking about I choose, and you used I choose about 3 or 4 times. I believe that you have a right to I choose. Nobody else has that right. So if you choose that, as I said, our society does not condone that a pregnancy is a person, right? There is no person in your body. There is a living organism in your body, but it is not a person. So you have a right to choose what to do about that, because you are alive and you are dealing with life circumstances.
the Canadian Medical Association guideline on induced abortion states that gestation begins at conception. If the child in the womb is not a person, could you please tell me what species that child is? What species are we talking about? What species are we talking about when we're talking about the organism developing and growing in the womb?
What species? It's the same species as the woman, right? It's just not, at that point, it's not an independent species. It is totally dependent on that woman.
And is our humanity dictated by our dependency on other human beings? For example, I have a younger sister who is much more dependent on my parents than I am at the age of 24. Would we not agree that my younger, more dependent sister is equally human and equally deserving of human rights as I am, regardless of our change or our difference in dependency?
Well, you've moved around a few years here. This is about an intrauterine pregnancy that is totally dependent on this woman. Without this woman, this fetus would be dead, right? That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about a 24-year-old, and I don't know how old your sister is, but we're talking about something that's inside a woman's abdomen, right? In her uterus, totally dependent on her. And she decides that she cannot carry on any longer for many good reasons, as you mentioned. Usually there are very good reasons. There are very few women who are flippant about this. This is a crisis for a woman. She needs society's support in making her decision. Whatever that decision is, she has a right to choose.
Actually, that's
7 minutes.
Exactly. 14 minutes.
It was. Okay. No, I'm going to now open the floor. We have 15 minutes of Q&A. Here's what's going to happen. I want to give both our participants, it's only 15 minutes, I want to give both our participants equal opportunity to answer questions. I'm not taking any statements. Nobody's making statements. These have to be questions, and they have to be fairly brief. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to ask first for a show of hands for somebody that wants to ask a question of Dr. Fellows, and then I'll ask for a show of hands for those who want to ask a question of Oriana. That way, I won't be choosing two in a row, for the same person. So first, a show of hands for someone who wants to ask Dr. Fellows a question. All right, back there, you had your hand up first in the second to the last row.
Yeah. So you told me to make these statements. I just want to start by saying it's kind of weird that you're talking past each other almost. I don't know if anybody else feels like that. I want to bring everybody's attention to something called Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development. He was adapting Jean Piaget's theory. Everybody know Jean Piaget, development psychologist, who's French anyway. So he has these stages.
You're actually making a statement. Please, do you have a question?
Okay.
A question in there?
So
Yeah.
it seems like the pro-life side is making a lot of moral arguments, like universal morality, and the doctor is saying that well, society has already decided, and we don't need to be universal. So my question to him exactly is: you said that you can perform abortion within 23 weeks and 6 days. Why not 7 days? What is the difference? Like, at what threshold does it become something wrong to do because they've gained an extra day of life?
So the question is, why 23/6 and why 24? Why not 24? And the question, I thought I answered that earlier, which is that the Canadian Pediatric Society decreed that at 24 weeks they can potentially assist a fetus that is born at that age, and there is a slight possibility that that fetus could be born intact and not experience major disabilities or illness as a result of being born before that gestational age. There is some talk that the Canadian Pediatric Society may lower that to 22 weeks, in which case I'm sure that the provision of abortion would probably change, and abortions would not be done after 22 weeks. But at this particular time, the skills of the neonatologists in caring for and resuscitating fetuses to the point where they can be intact and survive is 24 weeks.
Okay, thank you. All right, I need a question for Oriana. Right there in the middle. Yeah.
So, around in 2017, I saw an article.
And loud and stand up.
So in 2017, I saw an article which showed that scientists created an artificial uterus which they could help grow certain animals like a lamb or maybe even a pig. My question is, if this technology could be brought to human usage, what would your opinions be on maybe instead of actually having to terminate a fetus or something, but instead extract the fetus and grow it in one of these artificial uteruses? What would your thoughts on that be?
It's definitely an interesting question, and I have read or come across articles of the like. I think it's hard right now to give a definitive answer as to how society should accommodate and incorporate such technology into the way we deal with young human beings of that age. Of course, my position and that of my colleagues at CCBR is that human beings deserve human rights, and that human rights should begin when human life begins. And since we know that preborn children are human because their parents are human and they're growing and developing and therefore they're alive, then any act or any activity or anything done to those human beings that would violate their basic human rights would be a human rights violation. In the case of artificial uteruses and how that would impact the development of preborn children. I mean, there's a lot to consider in terms of extraction of those embryos or those fetuses, depending on their gestational age, from the natural womb of their mother into the artificial embryo. Things like that would have to be considered. I myself am interested, given that this technology is not fully developed yet, and what the risks associated would be for the woman as well as the preborn child, because as we know, they are both human beings, and therefore their rights need to be protected, and anything that would violate those human rights should not be allowed. So again, yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's a bit premature to discuss how that type of technology can be incorporated, given that we don't have enough details at this moment.
Thank you. Doctor, I believe you put forth the statistic that in the last 28 years, on average, there have been 100,000 abortions performed in Canada each of those years. So that's soon 3 million abortions. I don't want to dwell on that number, but I did appreciate your point that we need to do a better job of providing both men and women with contraception such that nobody is put in this very unfortunate position. So very recently, the government in Ontario has made, I assume the birth control pill is now covered for anyone under the age of 25 years, and if I'm not mistaken, it's up until that age where the vast majority of abortions are required, women 25 and under. So, in my opinion, that is a step in the right direction. But
you got a question in there?
Yeah, how do we do even better? So, how are we going to educate people to be responsible enough that they take the pill so that they don't get in this situation in the first place, or that young men wear a condom to not put women in that position? Thank you.
Well, I think I had 4 points in terms of what we as a society can do. And I think, the first place that it starts is in the home. I think we as parents of young children have an obligation to familiarize them with those things that could put them in the unfortunate situation, the tragic situation, where they are pregnant and not willingly pregnant. And so educating kids at home, educating kids at school, being part of the curriculum, and doing things like the current government, provincial government has done, and making access to methods of prevention affordable at no cost.
Well, how much, I don't know what a monthly prescription for the pill is, but I really don't assume that it's prohibitive.
The prescription without the government's coverage?
Yes.
Is at least $25 a month.
Okay.
For Oriana, who's in the very back row there? Oh, finally, a woman, okay.
So acknowledging the situations you described where women felt that they had no choice to have due to circumstances such as poverty and or abuse. I'm just curious about why you endorse exposing yet another human being to that situation.
Thank you for your question. Let me start by saying that I myself can't imagine how difficult, and I think we can agree that any such difficult circumstance regarding or surrounding pregnancies, such as, let's say, extreme poverty or lack of support from, let's say, a partner, would be extremely difficult for a woman to go through. And that's where that vulnerability and feeling of loneliness or not having more to turn to comes from, which I think is really sad. You specifically asked about bringing another human being into the world and exposing them to that suffering. And I'm glad that you brought that up, and I'm glad that you recognize that there is a second human being involved, that suffering in this world does exist, and that you want to alleviate the suffering. I'd ask us to consider how we can alleviate suffering as opposed to eliminating the sufferers. For example, in Toronto, there's a problem with homelessness. Now, I would never suggest that we should deal with that problem of homelessness by killing off those who are homeless. This doesn't help the people who are in those difficult circumstances. It just wipes the problem away without actually dealing with it. In terms of crisis pregnancies, difficult pregnancies, we should address the root problem, the root cause, as opposed to terminating one of the life of one of the two human beings within that situation, because that doesn't actually deal with the problem at hand. The example, or one of the examples I brought up in my opening statement, was a woman who's extreme poverty. Let's say that there's a woman who, maybe she has a few children and she finds herself pregnant. And of course, that's a difficult circumstance. How is she going to provide for her children and yet bring another baby into that world? Now, let's say for sake of the argument that she did decide to keep that child. And so the child is born, let's say she has a 3-month-old baby, Lily, in her hands. If she finds that her circumstance is so difficult, is it okay for her to end the life of her born child because of the circumstance she finds herself in? No, of course not. We would never say that an appropriate way to deal with suffering is to eliminate those in that circumstance who are suffering. If we wouldn't do that with born children, why would we allow that with pre-born children? Our humanity is not dictated by, our circumstances do not dictate our humanity, excuse me. And so we should strive as a society to support women, to support children who find themselves in difficult circumstances, but we should do so by finding proper solutions that address the problems, as opposed to terminating the individuals who are in those circumstances themselves.
Final question for Dr. Fellows, and then there'll be one more for Ariana, and that'll be it. Okay, you in the baseball hat.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I guess my question is, several hundred years ago in society, in Western society, me personally, I wouldn't have been considered a human, or a person, right? So I want to ask, because a lot of your arguments have been based off of social norms and or what society deems responsible. Is society the perfect measure to determine if me or an unborn baby should be a person with rights?
Good question. Do you have an alternative to society making decisions for society?
I would say a democracy is only made stronger by us trying to change it and make it the best we can. So we have to have this discussion, but we can always consistently rework it. I would say that.
Absolutely, I agree with you that if our society decides that through the democratic process that we do not do abortions, then society will have their way. We know that. But typically, a society like ours, where we are allowed to decide our fates, men and women have made these choices. Men and women support a woman's right to choose. They don't necessarily themselves say they would have an abortion, but the majority of our society says a woman has the right to choose what goes on with her body, whether it's her head, her brain, whether it's her heart, who she marries, or whether it's the uterus, whether she has a pregnancy carry on or not. That's what society has decided, and I can't come up with a better solution to it. I think, as I say, my only way of approaching this as a person who is concerned about doing abortions. I don't like doing abortions, but I find them necessary in the context of my training, and I'll continue to do them as long as society condones it. If society says it's not legal, it's not appropriate, I won't be doing them, for sure.
Okay, final question for Oriana. Okay.
Thank you. So the way I see it, the basic debate is one side sees two parties and the other sees one, being woman and a baby. But I've sort of been, thinking about this question personally. And my question is what about everybody else? If we have, a well-bred horse, we have a thoroughbred consent, and we have one horse that can jump well and another, and you put them together, you have a higher chance of a greater horse that can jump better. So from that standpoint, for the betterment of humanity, isn't it best that we can choose certain people with whom I certainly agree that it would be wrong to abort them, but on the other hand, someone else needs to decide where that line is. If we can somehow improve all of humanity, improve all of our, futures together, then shouldn't that be prioritized over just one person from a utilitarian perspective?
If I can be quite honest, I think that's a pretty scary thought to have. And the reason I think that is because the major problem there is who decides, who has the right to decide who lives and who dies. By what criteria and what governing body are we going to decide which human beings are of more value and more deserving of their lives, and which human beings are in a way disposable and not necessarily beneficial to the rest of society. By that logic, one could say that young human beings who don't have an education, such as children is what I'm referring to, don't have an education, don't have a stable job, don't contribute financially into the market, they're not necessarily benefiting society. In fact, they're a drain on society. Older human beings have to provide for them, have to care for them. It's draining, it's not in a way helping or bettering society. Would we ever say, for example, that it would be okay to eliminate young human beings in order to alleviate, by your logic, the burden on society? Would that be okay? Likewise, we could turn to the elderly and say, by a different set of criteria, that they're not contributing to the betterment of society or contributing to the functionality of society. I think we hit a slippery slope when we start to discuss which human beings are worthy of their lives. And again, that's now adding additional criteria into or additional criteria on top of just basic human rights and our shared humanity. Because when it comes to what the bottom line is that all of us human beings, we all differ in multiple ways, and we differ in gender and age, in skin color and religion and race, and there's on and on. There's tons of differences. The only thing that we have in common, that is in common with all human beings, is our shared humanity. And so when we start to discriminate against human beings using additional criteria like we've seen in past human rights violations, then ultimately someone always gets left out. And so the only way to ensure that everyone's lives are protected, everyone's basic human rights are protected, is to employ objective scientific criteria as to who is a human being, who deserves human rights, and that those human rights should be given when human life begins. Okay, thanks.
Okay, both are going to make their closing statements now, and this time we'll start with Oriana.
No, sorry. Same order.
Same order?
Dr. Order.
Oh,
Dr.
sorry.
Order. Dr. Fried. Dr. Fellows.
Dr. Fellows, and then Oriana. Okay, sure. Here, just...
Not that. Yeah. Leave your slides? Sure.
Oriana?
Oh, my apologies.
From the beginning?
No, just 2 more slides.
Okay, so 9 and 10? Number 10, response? Okay, sure thing. You're good to go.
So here's my
On the mic.
Here's my response. What happens when women are denied choice with respect to abortion? There are numerous examples over the decades of women being denied access to safe abortion. As published by the Guttmacher Institute in the States 15 years ago in the American Journal of Public Health, there were 42 million abortions in the world in 2003. Half of them were in countries where abortion was legal, half of them were in countries where abortion was illegal. The difference for the women that in the countries where abortions were illegal was that the maternal mortality and morbidity was exponentially higher than in countries that offered women a safe abortion. If you remember nothing else about my response, you remember the name Ceausescu. This was an infamous couple, husband and wife, who took over as the leaders of Romania between 1980 and 1989. Amongst the many cruelties that they inflicted upon their society, they campaigned against women's right to not only contraception or abortion, but also contraception. And they deployed marauding armies of enforcers, so they go around the country and ensure that women were not using contraception and certainly not getting abortions. The results of this campaign did not stop women from achieving the desired abortions, but it did lead to a 30-fold increase in maternal deaths, maternal mortality, compared to the rest of the European countries during the same period. And morbidity, and the phenomenon of the Romanian street children. So if you look into, if you Google the Ceausescus and you Google their atrocities, you will be apprised of what happens when you deny women the right to choose. And this is a microcosm of what goes on worldwide. Women demand control of their bodies. They demand the right to choose. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
everyone can hear me all right?
No.
Now they can. Dr. Fellow's argument in favor of abortion can be summarized by saying that because the majority of society does not assign moral status to the human fetus or embryo, they are therefore personas non gratas, or non-persons, and that they do not deserve the most basic and fundamental human rights, the very right to life. I'm going to start my closing statement by addressing what Dr. Fellows just brought up, and that is maternal mortality and effect that illegal or restricted abortion has on women. Now, to that, I'd first like to start off by saying that regardless of whether or not abortion is legal, it is always lethal for one of the two human beings involved, and that is that of the preborn child. Now, that said, I find it interesting I find it quite interesting that in order to determine the effects on society of abortion were not accessible, Dr. Fellows chose to compare Canada, a developed country that prides itself as champions in human rights and equality, with that of the state of Romania during a totalitarian, backwards regime over 30 years ago. If we're going to compare ourselves to a totalitarian regime that instituted abortion as a social good, perhaps we should at least use a more current example, such as China. Here we see the effects of abortion on a society that has embraced abortion fully. The result? Over 30 million more men than women that the Chinese population cannot support, leading to social devastation. What is happening in China in regards to sex-selective abortion and population imbalances among men and women is something that we already see starting to happen here in Canada. A 2016 study published in the Canadian Medical Journal titled Sex Ratios at Birth After Induced Abortion reports high male-to-female ratios observed among infants born to women who immigrated from India, meaning that the practice of sex-selective abortion does indeed take place in Canada and is hurting the youngest and most vulnerable girls to the point of death, simply because they are girls. As another more current example, in 2013, a study titled The Impact of Reproductive Laws on Maternal Mortality, the Chilean Natural Experiment, examined the effects of restricted abortion in modern-day Chile and found the following. Abortion restriction in Chile was not associated with an increase in overall maternal mortality or with abortion deaths and total number of abortions. Contrary to the notion proposing a negative impact of restrictive abortion laws on maternal health, the abortion mortality ratio did not increase after the abortion ban in Chile. Rather, it decreased over 96%, from 10.8 to 0.39 per 100,000 live births. Now, I ended my opening statement by talking about the negative effects that abortion has on women. And I'd like to continue that at this point. The research that I had previously presented by the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons further asked or surveyed those 987 women and found that among the most top 3 negative effects that abortion had on them, the top responses were 1, the feeling that the woman had lost a life, 2, depression, and 3, feelings of guilt and remorse. This research, in addition to the increased rates of drug abuse or prescription drug use and increased counseling and regular visits to psychologists, suggests that abortion is not no big deal and definitely should not be passed off as such. It can be life-altering for a woman, of course. Now, I don't doubt that everyone here tonight agrees with me that the right to make choices, that we have the right to make choices as to what we do with our bodies. However, can we not agree that our rights to make such choices should end when when a choice that we want to make has a negative impact, a negative consequence on someone else's body? We are all pro-choice when it comes to certain things. For example, we're pro-choice when it comes to what clothing we want to wear or what kind of car we want to drive. However, we're all anti-choice when it comes to choices that harm other human beings. Now, a woman has every right to make choices for herself and for her body, whether that be her sexual preferences or other. However, when a woman chooses an abortion, it's not her body, but rather the body of her preborn child that is being directly and intentionally targeted for death. Abortion is not a choice that one chooses for themselves, but rather for a choice that harms to the very point of death another human being. And if we're anti-choice when it comes to choices that harm older, born human beings, then wouldn't it logically follow that we should also be anti-choice when we're talking about choices that harm younger, preborn human beings, such as abortion? Tonight, the debate question we've been asked to address is abortion. Whose body, whose choice? Now, we've walked through the scientific evidence of when human life begins. We know that because preborn children have human parents, they must be human. And we know that because they're growing and developing in the womb throughout the gestational period, that they are indeed alive. If preborn children are human and living just like you and me, wouldn't it logically follow that they deserve the same human rights you and I do? Would it not further follow that any act that would harm that preborn child would be a violation of his or her human rights? Now, earlier tonight, I described to you the different types of abortions that are performed. Now, this tool that I'm about to show you is a surgical forceps that has been used by an abortionist over 1,200 times to end the life of human beings. Now, this forceps would have been opened by the abortionist, inserted into a woman's uterus, and clamped down on the fetal body part. As described by the National Abortion Federation guidelines, the abortionist would have then crushed down, twisted on whatever he could grab, and pull out. That would have been the baby's arm. He would then repeat this procedure over and over, extracting fetal parts piece by piece until the uterus had been emptied. Once that would be done, a curette, another abortion tool, would be used to make sure that no fetal remains were present. This is what we do to Canada. This is what we do to preborn children in our country every single day. What you see here is what happens. What you see here is what we are talking about when we're talking about the choice about abortion. The question I have and that I want to leave with you today is this an acceptable choice? Can we knowingly, having examined the scientific evidence that preborn children are human beings, are we going to allow this to continue? Because if we do, then every single day, 300 more corpses continue to pile up. Thank you.
All right, everyone. I think we can all agree that having a public forum like this is super special. There's something about congregating in a room and seeing ideas being exchanged live that is very different than just watching a YouTube video or reading an editorial. Getting the ability to perhaps ask a question, see people think on the spot, use persuasion and rhetoric. These are all very important things, even if ultimately your stance on the issue has not changed at all. But with that being said, you all received a form. It's a survey, so please take a moment to fill it out, and then you can leave it at the table up front here. And let's continue the conversation over at the on-campus pub, Wilf's. Thank you for coming.